Hi, I'm Scott Campbell. I am the Rinehart Chair of Mediated Communication in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University. I work in the field of mobile media and communication. I always have, and that goes back to early days of working in the mobile communication industry. I worked for Sprint PCS in the United States when they were launching their first national digital 2G mobile communication network. That was in 1997 when I started with them. And I worked in product development and I worked in marketing operations over the period of about 4 years at Sprint PCS. While I was there, my first few years, I was also earning a master's degree on the side and doing a little bit of teaching because I thought I wanted to be an academic. But I was paying attention to what was going on in the industry I was working in because I was quite fascinated by the fact that not only that this new technology was allowing people to connect without being tethered to space, but what blew me away was how quickly everybody was getting a cell phone and using a cell phone in daily life. It was not long before my coworkers and I at the world headquarters for Sprint in Kansas City, not long before we would go out for lunch and notice that everybody had a cell phone. And this was a little earlier because we were working in the industry, and so the company gave us cell phones, and we were the early adopters, and we were running around with our cell phones. So I had a little bit of an early glimpse of this, but it didn't take long for me to realize that my friends, my family, everybody around was getting mobile communication as well. So I had decided that it was going to be time for me to leave the industry so that I could go to graduate school to study what the implications of this are. I could see that the world was changing because I had worked in the industry in the early 90s as well. And that was when the World Wide Web really became a thing, and it revolutionized how we did our work. And eventually it revolutionized how we did our lives. And so I thought, well, this is another big turn where people are really connecting with one another anytime, anywhere. We didn't have the internet on our cell phones at the time. So this was more about interpersonal communication, but we saw that the internet was coming with 3G down the road. So I decided in around 99 that I was going to go to graduate school. And in 2002, I finished what I believe is the first dissertation on the social uses and consequences of mobile phones. And I've been working as a professor in the area ever since. So I finished my undergraduate degree in 1992, and I had a degree in journalism, and I went into communications. I was a communications with an S specialist. And basically what that meant was that I was a professional desktop publisher. In 1992, if you did PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, you made things look professional, you were a professional at it. Now everybody, who's a 10-year-old can do the kind of documentation that I was doing at the time. But the point I want to make is that I was in the technology industry. I'd actually had internships with Apple Computer as an undergrad. I'd always been working in technology industry. Part of that was just opportunity. That's the way that the world was changing at the time. But it did fascinate me ever since I was even in my internships in undergrad. I could see the world changing. I was inspired to understand how the world was changing. But another reason why I went to graduate school was because I also had an opportunity to spend some years working in a cubicle, and that will do it. So on the industry side, there's a real focus on product development. When I was working in product development, we were working on very technical standards for over-the-air provisioning and fraud and privacy products. And then when I went to marketing operations, the bottom line there was making sure that everybody had everything that they needed so that we could sell this stuff in retail channels. And so the bottom line was really what I wanted to change. I was very interested in mobile communication the whole time, but the bottom line working in industry is to try to make money and to try to beat your competitors and to try to establish a marketplace. That part of it was less interesting to me. The development of the technology, the way that we were going to live our lives differently with the technology, that fascinated me. And so I had to go to graduate school to be able to spend my time thinking about that. Yeah, so at first, mobile communication scholarship was really kind of a one-off. When I was working on my dissertation, there were no other dissertations on the topic. There was literature. We have some very familiar names like Rich Ling and Jim Katz and Leopoldina Fortunati and others that I was able to find papers and pull together a really early literature review of mobile communication studies. But I don't think it was a field at that time at all. And in fact, like I said, I believe my dissertation was the first one on the topic. So far from a field, just a few kind of what felt like renegade individuals, but all kind of moving in similar directions, actually. Like if you look at what those people were doing that I just mentioned, some of the founders of the field, they were moving in some similar directions. They were having workshops together. And I think that's where the seeds of the field started, was two things. Number one was a shared interest in our questions, but number two was a desire for community. And I think we still have that. I actually think that's really what drives our field is we all have our scholarly interests that we're pursuing, but we want to share them with each other. We want to get together and we want to identify as scholars in this area. So we didn't have that. And I would say that we slowly built that up through the pre-conferences at ICA, through edited volumes, through the journal. And I would say it feels to me like around 2013 when the journal, Mobile Meeting Communication, launched, that's when I started really feeling like we kind of had a field. And I felt like we were really building some good momentum up through pre-conferences and things. But once we got our journal going, I felt like that kind of marked it. A lot has changed, and a lot has not changed, I would say, in the field. What has not changed to me is that sense of community that drives the field, the desire for us to share, and not just share what we know, but to share our passions and to enjoy what we do together. That I've always had that feeling 20 years ago and today when I get together with my colleagues. So that feels very familiar, and a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new faces too. But what's changed? Well, we've grown. I would say one thing that's changed is we've gone from this kind of scrappy bunch of individuals trying to figure out something new into, I would say, a pretty well-established, recognized field. And what we're doing is no longer new in terms of mobile communication. It's now a very taken for granted thing, as Rich Ling has written about. Yet, it's always new. There's always new opportunities. I don't want to make too much of the so-called smartphone turn, but I'll point to it as an example of how opportunities in the field changed dramatically, I think, not just because of the technology, but because everybody in the world agreed to go along with this shift and to use the technology in some coherent ways that we can study. So, for example, just to mention one specific thing that has changed in the field, spatiality and location awareness has been a huge game changer in terms of navigation, coordination, gaming, a lot of things. So the field has really opened up and it's put us in touch with other fields. The spatiality of mobile communication now puts us in touch with mobility studies people. And so I think that's really exciting. When I think about my contribution to the field, I kind of think of it on two levels. At different points in my career, I've had sort of different phases of interests. I was very interested in my very early research in looking at the ways that social networks were creating their own meanings and uses of the technology, socially constructing the technology in very distinctive ways. I moved into a phase in my career where I did a lot of work on what are the political implications of this technology? How are people using it for political discourse? To what extent is it bringing us together, pulling us apart? How does it affect the way that we engage in politics? And I've got some other areas, like right now I've got solitude, the opposite of anytime, anywhere communication. A lot of papers on solitude, what it means in the digital era. But what I actually think my real job is in this field, to me, is to write papers about the field. And I have several of those, and I'm working on a couple of those papers now. For example, there's one paper I'm working on with somebody that is trying to push the boundaries of the field so that we can look at virtual mobilities instead of just physical mobilities. And that's an example of the kind of argument, the kind of paper that I think of as kind of my primary job is to pay attention to what's going on in the field and to write papers about changes in the field and opportunities in the field. Well, I have a lot of influences because I'm heavily influenced by all of my colleagues that I read and that I'm writing with. So I wouldn't be able to like just pick one or two and say this is, my primary, but I am going to pick two as examples. I feel like I'm very influenced by people, I don't know how to put this, people above me in terms of seniority and in terms of just history and knowledge and experience, and people that are not above, I don't want to say below me, but like younger, fresh thinking scholars. So like I would say right now, a lot of my thinking is influenced by Rich Ling and the work that he's done, a lot of foundational work, a lot of other scholars too. I'm just using him as an example. It guides my thinking, but then I'm working a lot with Morgan Ross, who's a very junior scholar in the field right now. And his perspectives are a little different than Rich's, of course. And when I spend time with Morgan and I spend time with Rich, I feel like I've got, a lot of what's new, a lot of what's established, and it kind of gives me a balance and a little bit of, I guess, diversity in terms of the new thinking, the established thinking, and then putting those together so you can make sense of what's going on in a dynamically changing environment. I think as a field, we need to be a little careful with how we define ourselves as a field. I think we need to be a little careful with our boundaries. There's a lot that's changing, and that always has been the case and always will be the case with mobile communication. We saw the smartphone turn. We might be seeing a similar kind of turn right now towards mobile AI, and then we've seen a lot of changes and turns within these major turns. And so I think as technology changes, but also as society and social practice changes, as we live our lives in a more digital and physical way, as a field, I think we need to keep our eye more on the fundamental, elemental things that are going on with mobile media and communication. And by that, I mean, not so much what the technology is doing, not what the technology is doing for us or what it affords or how we use it, but really like what's underneath all of that, because the technology is always going to change. So what is mobile communication? Mobile communication is people basically moving themselves around and re-experiencing space through movement. We've always thought of that in terms of physical movement. And I think that the field, for example, might want to consider how digital movements intersect with physical movements a little more deeply as we live our lives in more digital, physical, hybrid ways. So maybe the field has a little bit too much emphasis on physicality. And I think in the future, virtual mobilities might come into play a little bit more. Good question. How should the division grow? I think right now, I'm thinking about this in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of community. And in terms of community, I think that the most important way for the division to grow is for there to be more leaders that emerge and step into leadership roles by, serving as officers, but also, reviewing papers, being on the editorial board and publishing and being active in the field. I think the field has really recognizable leaders from the early days of the field, and a lot of those leaders are still around. And I'm seeing some more junior people coming into the field and recognizing them as the future of the field. And so I think that their leadership, and a lot of them have really stepped up in terms of leadership. I think their leadership is the answer to how is the field going to grow. Another thing I think that's important in terms of the field and the division moving forward is establishing relationships with other fields and divisions. There's a big kind of young growing group of disconnection scholars in ICA, for example. There's urban mobility scholars that we see at ICA, and they seem to be kind of growing. And so these are interesting groups to me because I feel like the reason why we have a need for disconnection, why we have a need to even study urban mobilities, largely is because of mobile media communication. They may not be explicitly studying mobile media communication in the way that we think of it, but I think mobile media communication is the reason why we see these other emergent fields coming up. And I would like us to embrace our cousin fields and find ways of doing more things together, maybe doing some joint pre-conferences together where we have some joint sessions, activities, events, special issues. But I do think that moving forward, mobile media communication increasingly is encroaching on every other field in communication. And so I think that we should, to the extent possible, lean into that and really try to leverage those connections.